All these memories of Tony and our wild times came flooding back as I tried to come to terms with the fact that he was dead. My best mate, my soulmate, blasted to death in cold blood, never given a chance, shot down like a rabid dog. I just couldn't believe it. I cried for a week, I drank for a week, I got angry for a week, and then I was ready to go looking for some answers. I'd no idea Tony and his boys had been in such danger. Yes, we lived a risky life, took chances, pulled a few scams, but it was all a game to me. It was like being on the outside of a gangster movie looking in. Now, I was hearing hardened coppers telling me I fitted the profile of the sort of bloke that could do this terrible thing. I was, they said, regarded as a hardened gangster with big-time crime connections. Was this really me? What sort of world had I got myself into? It was obvious that the police hadn't got a clue who was behind the triple murder. Neither had I. Neither had any of the mates I'd spoke to. I was getting sick of people asking me. I felt like they were pointing the finger. You was his best mate, you must know. I racked my brains day after day trying to remember people we'd met, places we'd been, deals we'd done, in the hope of a clue. I knew that if I found the killers first, I would have no qualms about executing my own retribution, but nothing came to me. Somewhere, in a distant memory, I recalled meeting a bloke known as Mickey the Pilot. Blinding geezer, I remember Tony saying, but he's paranoid as fuck, and his house has got more security cameras than Fort Knox. It didn't seem important. Not then, not yet. After the rest of the murders, I was doing a lot of thinking, wondering which people, which events might be significant. I remember how Tony had changed so much in the months before his death. How he'd become a contradiction of everything he stood for. Health, fitness, reliability were out the window, and he was on the slippery slope of serious drug abuse. All these incidences were swirling around in my head as I tried to fit the jigsaw together. I didn't know what was important, what wasn't, but I knew that somewhere there must be clues to this assassination of my pals, and I knew that I was in too deep for my own good. My name was hot in the gangland scene. I was into a lot of stuff inside the clubs and out. People were getting stabbed, people were getting killed on the doors. My name was being brought up too much for comfort. Tony's death was a wake-up call. I should have known where everything was leading, but I was blind to the stupidity of it all. Now I'd got 3 mates in a mortuary. I had suspected in the few weeks before the murders that Tony and Pat were up to something. They'd become very secretive. 2 weeks before the shootings, it was Tony's birthday, and we'd all gone to Hollywood's nightclub in Romford for a piss-up. I had a gut feeling that night. I had a bad feeling that something wasn't right. Pat seemed to be splitting up the friendship, the special bond between me and Tony. Right from the moment he came out, there was a spontaneous combustion between the two of them, a dangerous reaction you felt could explode at any minute. The trust between me and Tony was evaporating. We'd made a pact one night that I would look after him and he would look after me, and if either of us went off for a bit of business on our own, we'd let the other know. If I got into a dodgy situation, I knew Tony would cover my ass, and vice versa. If I disappeared, or he disappeared, we'd know where to start looking. But that was all changing. I asked him what was going on. He said, "I'm onto something very, very big, but don't worry, mate, I'll look after you." I knew that was true. The previous Christmas, I'd done a bit of business for Tony and taken him £2,800 in notes to his home. I'd hit a bit of a rough spot because I was always silly with my spending, treated everybody, and he knew it. Tony put the $2,800 on the table and he said, "You're skint, aren't you?" I said, "No, mate, I'm okay." But he knew. He said, "Here, take the 2,800. You and your kids have a good Christmas on me." Now, what sort of friend does that? I loved him for it. He knew I was struggling, and I couldn't hide it from him. There wasn't anything we could hide from each other, or so I thought. It was only after the murders that the dangerous secrets he had harboured finally emerged. He told Anna Whitehead, his girlfriend, that he was on to the big job, a big drugs deal worth over $1 million. A light plane was supposed to be flying a consignment of puff over from Belgium and landing it on a field near Rotterdam. Anna told me he kept saying, "I can't wait for this to go off. I'm going to give Carlton 20 or 30 grand out of it." She said he seemed more excited about giving me 30 grand than making a nice few quid for himself. It all turned out to be a hoax, but it rang bells with me. By then, I'd met the mysterious Mick the Pilot, Mickey Steele, at a party at a mate's snooker hall in Dagenham. He was with his missus, and he didn't have a lot to say to Tony or me. But later on, Tony said he'd got this big drugs deal on the boil, and did I want to put some money in and get a share of the profits. I said I hadn't got much dough and wasn't interested anyway. It turned out that this time it was a genuine deal, but the puff they brought back turned out to be gank gear, a pile of rubbish. It went back to the dealers and they got their money back. By now, almost on a daily basis, I could see Tony and Pat were on high octane fuel, getting wild, doing the most ridiculous things. They were doing dangerous stuff like racing their Porsches up and down the A127 Southend Arteria Road at 140 miles per hour after a night spent mainlining on pure cocaine. They were also jacking up on ketamine, Nubain and shit like that. Tony wasn't a womanizer, but he was shagging other birds all the time, partying, drug taking and so on. I remember one weekend I was trying to contact him but couldn't get hold of him. He was off the phone. It was important, so I went to his house in Chafford 100 and knocked on the door. I thought something had happened to him. The door opened and Craig Rolfe was there with Tony. Craig was out of it. Tony was sitting on the edge of a chair laughing, hallucinating on something. I said, "What the fuck's going on, Tony?" He muttered, "Oh, nothing, mate." I could see by his eyes he was on something heavy. He was pulling down his shirt sleeve to hide something. I grabbed it and pulled it up again. I was staggered. He had about 30 recent injection marks along his arm. "What the fuck are you doing, Tony?" I think he was too ashamed to speak. He was on the precipice and hadn't got a clue how close disaster was. The first puff deal had left a nasty taste in the mouth, and Tony, Pat and Craig had got the raging hump with Mickey Steele. To make matters worse, from what I'd heard, Mickey was having a relationship with Pat's Mrs. Sarah. Pat and Mickey had met in prison and had known each other a lot longer than Tony or Craig. So it was well out of order for Mickey to be bedding Pat's wife, even though Pat was always out on the town, always with other women. Pat was awesome. He was a big old boy with a big reputation, and he looked after a few people in prison and was well respected. He knew Reggie Cray well from Whitemore and had minded a gay boyfriend for him. Pat was a character and I liked him. Mickey got to hear that Pat knew about him and Sarah's affair and was gunning for him. So according to what I heard after the murders, Mickey and his pals decided to do Pat and the others before they did them. Mickey was very clever, very manipulative. He told Pat and Tony there was a big drugs deal going down and they would wait for a plane load of gear to arrive. When it landed, they would rob the people, take the drugs, grab the money and pull off a right old coup. The night they died, I was told my three mates had gone down that country lane on a dummy run to get the lie of the land. It was all a scam. Their trust, or perhaps it was their greed, was rewarded with that terrible massacre that shook the Essex gangland scene to the core. I wasn't invited on this deal, phony or otherwise, thank God, because they knew I hadn't got cash to invest. But that night, at the party, when I'd got that bad feeling and suspected something heavy was about to go off, I'd pulled Big Pat to one side and told him, "Look, I love Tony like a brother. If anything happens to him, I'll hold you responsible. Look after him. Don't let me down." I saw them on the Friday before the murders when we had a drink at Berwick Manor near Upminster. Their secretive attitude did nothing to lessen my fears for Tony's safety. They were whispering, furtive, and not their usual selves at all. The night of the massacre, Tony, Pat and Craig, three grown men, three dangerous men, all professional criminals, went out without a weapon between them. Their mobile phones were all switched off. They were driven to Snowy Workhouse Lane in Rettendon, where Mickey Steele's partner Jack Worms was already hiding with a gun. Steele was in the back seat and got out, supposedly to have a piss. Once he was out, Worms passed him a pump-action shotgun. He leaned in and opened fire. Rolfe died first, his skull blown away, his hand still gripping the steering wheel, his foot still on the brake. In a split second, Tony, sitting beside Rolfe, also got it in the head. Then Pat was blasted in the chest, head and belly by both gunmen as he begged for his life. When anyone you know dies suddenly or violently, it sends a shockwave of nausea through your body that makes you physically sick. As the details of the triple murder emerged, as yet with the killers unknown, I was wrecked with a mixture of dread, panic and anger that led me shaking with rage. The next morning the police were around my house in Brentwood saying I could be a suspect. I'd got a team of boys round me from my own firm looking after me, and I was crying like a baby. "No way," I said. "Not Tony." I told the cops. "Let's get one thing clear. If you badmouth my pal, if you slag him off, you can fuck off out of here right now." One copper said, "We only want to eliminate you from our inquiries, Carlton." I fumed. "Eliminate me? He was the best fucking mate I ever had." He said, "Well, right now, you are the top of our suspects list." The weeks had dragged on since the Rettendon murders, and I needed answers. I knew who might supply them. Bizarre as it sounds, I was prepared to place my faith in a medium, a spiritualist, in one last desperate attempt to claim the raging fury that was driving me insane day after day. I was paranoid with anxiety by now, fearful of the constant police surveillance, worrying that every passing car, every motorbike might be carrying a hitman who would finish off what Rettendon had started. I'd got up morning after morning, looked at myself in the mirror and said, "What have you got yourself into?" I'd hoped Shirley might help. I knew the police had used her with some success to solve crimes or find missing people, and my mum swore by her powers. I wasn't sure, but my mind was so troubled by now, I drove to her home in Gants Hill and asked for a sitting. No names, no background. I just needed to know whatever she told me was not tainted by anything she might have read or heard about in the papers or seen on the TV news. Just Joe Blogs, come for a consultation. I wanted to make contact with a missing friend, I told her. What I heard in her parlour that afternoon shook me rigid. I was there for about half an hour. She sat holding pieces of gold I'd handed her at her request, a sort of lighting conductor to the afterworld, as she sought to make contact with Tony. Her eyes glazed over. She seemed to have reached someone, some spirit somewhere out there in the ether. I went cold. I got shivers down my spine. The hairs on my neck stood upon end, bearing in mind that she had no idea who I was or why I was there, and at that stage knew little about the murders. She was uncanny. She sniffed the air and said, "I can smell aftershave. Does that mean anything?" I told her I bought my pal a bottle of Hugo Boss aftershave for his birthday 2 or 3 weeks earlier. "He's just died, hasn't he?" she said. That hadn't taken a lot of working out, so I was still far from convinced that, eerie though it was, this wasn't just guesswork and a bit of gimmicky theatrics. She held my gold chain, rubbing it gently, and within minutes she started crying uncontrollably. There was a weird aura in the room. She looked at me and said, "You've lost someone very close to you, haven't you? Something terrible has happened." Now I was starting to take notice. She lapsed almost into a trance as she went on. "I've never seen so much violence, so much blood." She knew that 3 people had died. She said they were angry. They didn't want to go. One of them, she said, was a close friend who wanted to make contact with me. She kept saying violence, pain, anger. They were trapped, she said, unable to move on to the next life because of the way they'd been killed. It could take a year before their souls could move on. I needed to know who killed them. Who did it? "Do you know their names?" I pleaded, thinking this might be the route towards a speedy revenge. She seemed to be looking into the distance. Then she said, "I don't know, but I can see 3 men standing together, looking into the sky, pointing at a small plane. They are shouting, 'You bastard, Mick, you bastard.'" She could see a Range Rover. She could see a white van with men getting into it. She could see a motorbike. I was just sitting across the room, a few feet away, with my jaw dropping, amazed, astounded at what I was hearing, but still cynical. At that point, only a Range Rover featured in the murder scenario. No one, not me, not the police, not the families of those involved, knew anything about white vans or motorbikes or pilots, features of the case, which were only to become significant many months later. I was telling myself, get real, Carlton, how can you know these things? To a down-to-earth East End boy, while all this was fascinating, mind-bogglingly even, she knew I was unconvinced. She said, "To let you know, I am telling you the truth. Your friend has asked me to mention Suffolk. Well, you could have knocked me down with a feather. Just 2 weeks earlier, me, Tony, Pat and Craig, the whole firm, had gone up to Suffolk by car to sort out a problem at one of the clubs Tony handled the security, where some local dealers were serving up drugs which were not approved by Tony. The manager asked Tony to get a heavy team to sort it. We got 2 carloads, about 8 of us altogether, all experienced lumps in the muscle game, and we planned to arrive by surprise, lock up the back doors of the club, trap the dealers inside so they couldn't run anywhere, then clean up the problem. A commando raid in essence. We thought one of the doormen was in on the racket as well, so we needed to give him some special attention. It was a big mess and needed heavy treatment. We were happy to help Tony out. None of us was averse to a decent ruck. Some of us went through the back doors and bolted them. The others went in through the front. If anybody ran out seeing our team staggering in, then they'd be trapped like rats. But as it happened, someone had tipped the local dealers off, and when we got there it was all quiet like a village church. There wasn't any dealer to be seen. The local punters were quiet. They'd been scared shitless at the sight of 8 fucking great bodybuilders up from the smoke and stayed in small groups very quietly. It all passed off peacefully, but we knew the warning message would get through to anyone thinking of taking us on any time. We just had a few drinks before heading home. Now, there was no way this medium could have known anything about that. It wasn't something we talked about outside the firm. It was never in the papers. Yes, she knew too much for it simply to be a lucky guess, a stab in the dark. I was getting goose pimples now. Your friend has told me to mention Suffolk, so you'll know it's him talking to you, she repeated. I knew all right. I didn't care if no one else in the world believes me or not. I knew from what I heard, and she couldn't fake that. I was taking a few notes on a pad. My hand was shaking, making my writing spindle almost unreadable. I wish now I'd tape recorded it all, so I could have a record of everything she said. Your friend is telling you not to take revenge. Don't go after the people who did this yourself. He's saying they will take their own revenge in the fullness of time. She went into a sort of hypnotic state again. I can see a small plane in the sky, she said. Now it's burst into flames and it's crashing down. Is that the revenge? I asked. Yes, that's their revenge, she said. The police were visiting me regularly then about the murders, and the next time they came I showed them the notes of my curious consultation with Madame Shirley. The old bill was always come to me, not the other way round. I didn't want to keep any meets with them because, like I say, I had this dark suspicion in the back of my mind that they had killed Tony and the boys. A bit of criminal ethnic cleansing to get rid of a firm getting too big for its boots. I had no evidence, just a gut feeling. It was wrong, as it happens, but at that point in time, it was a very real possibility to me and the most plausible explanation for the murders. Nevertheless, I knew I had to tell them about the session with Shirley, how intense it all was, how she had been left drained by the experience, how I'd left them bewildered by it all. The cops sort of looked at me sideways, like I'd cracked up, blown it, taken leave of my senses. This wasn't something they could take back to the Nick as evidence. Shirley had freaked me out. I can't pretend anything else. A big, strong, hard man like me came out of there a blubbering wreck. I wished I hadn't gone there. Too much was going on inside my head that I couldn't comprehend. Anyway, when the detectives came again and I told them about the consultation, one of them jotted a few notes down as I read from the pad I'd taken to Shirley's. You could tell he wasn't that interested. They wanted more practical help. What they were trying to do then was to get me to draw people out, go to telephone boxes and ring people up, tried to get them to say things about the murders which might provide some clues, names maybe, or a motive. They still had few leads and mouths were staying shut in Essex. So many people said the same thing. Nobody much liked the Tucker firm, or the Essex boys as they were known, and they were running out of control and getting up the noses of a lot of people. Plenty would like to see them dead. Police and customs files were bulging with information about big drug deals, rip-offs of other dealers, shootings, stabbings, and even a murder in which Tony, Pat and Craig were supposed to have been involved. I knew a different Tony Tucker. Great mate, soulmate really. We'd had so many good times in the last few years. I believed most of his money came from his successful security firm, supplying doormen for clubs and bars, in his health shop supplying bodybuilding foods and accessories legally, steroids illegally. Sure, I knew he was a bit of a face with some big time aspirations and some heavy underworld connections, but to me, he was generally a really nice guy. I could see things had been changing since he formed a criminal triumvirate with the other two and had started taking drugs like there was no tomorrow and get involved in stuff he couldn't control. But he was still my greatest mate, and I wasn't ready to hear people slagging him off now he was dead, or slagging him off ever, come to that. The cops really didn't want to know about the messages from beyond. They were chasing their own theories. But the detective who'd taken notes that day about my visit to Shirley was to come up to me many months later and say, "Carlton, when you told me about that white transit van, I shivered. We'd only just found out ourselves that the killers were probably picked up in a battered white transit, but no one else outside the murder squad could have known." Another weird thing that happened after the murders was Tony's home at Fobbing getting spooked. His mate Andy was looking after the place because Anna wouldn't stay there, despite all the security lights and fencing and alarms and guard dogs. She was frightened for her life as well, so Andy was there every day to feed the dogs and horses. He phoned me and said, "Cole, something weird is going on." He'd gone there and found lights turned on that he'd switched off the night before, pictures turned upside down, dogs let out when they should have been in. He phoned Anna, but she hadn't been there. He told me, "I'm petrified. I'm sure it's Tony trying to say something." I was glad that it wasn't just me having these weird experiences over Tony's death.